You bring that up. Everyone, we apologize for the technical difficulties. We flipped rooms for some reason. So I am not going to do the full introduction only because time is of the essence, and Mike Hollis went over a lot of great information in the beginning, and he was so gracious to join me in the correct room. So without any further ado, Mike Hollis is the Urban Farm Director for services for the underserved, and they're based in New York City. And so I'd like to turn the controls back to him so he can go ahead and we'll restart from the beginning. So thank you all for your patience.
Hi, everyone. Yes, and apologies for that confusion, and thank you very much for sticking around for the last half hour or so as we found the correct place to be broadcasting. I will go through, just for the purposes of time and to kind of respect your time, some of the slides a little more quickly than perhaps originally intended. And what I'll say is I'll try to go through the slides quickly enough where we actually leave some time at the end for general discussion. So rather than kind of taking questions or opening up the floor during the presentation, we'll treat the comment area as kind of like an idea and question parking space or a garden to kind of insert things for now. And then once we've gone through all the slides, we'll take a look through those and kind of return to specific topics to have more detailed discussion on or to address any questions that might come up. To confirm, everyone's able to see my PowerPoint, correct? Excellent. Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up, so we will kind of go ahead and move ahead. Introductions, as I mentioned, we won't jump into that quite yet, just in the interest of time, but to take a look at the workshop questions, so kind of the questions that we'll be addressing through this. Two big ones are how urban areas can begin to use lessons for regenerative design. And by regenerative design, I'm referring to urban planning that is using urban regenerative agriculture as a model, so kind of taking those regenerative agriculture principles and applying them to kind of an urban planning framework. And then what links do these activities, so these regenerative design practices, create between urban and rural communities? A quick outline, we're gonna go relatively quickly through urban sustainability. And apologies that it'll be quite dense. This will be looking at some of the challenges that cities can present from a sustainability standpoint, looking specifically at the framework for New York City's sustainability initiatives, doing an overview of a couple of New York City's sustainability projects that have been enacted or are currently taking place. And then from there, looking more specifically at regenerative design. So what are some of the general goals from regenerative urban planning, an overview of some global and New York City-based regenerative projects, and then as a jumping point for our discussion, what some of the largest challenges might be for creating a regenerative bioregion. So kicking it off with urban sustainability. Some challenges to sustainability. So New York City is experiencing some incredible growth. We're looking at 9 million folks expected to be living within New York City as a political boundary by 2050. An additional 1 million that would be commuting into or visiting the city each day. A regional population of 23 million that's expected to exceed 26 million by 2050. So very large numbers for our area. All of this connected to a need for better system infrastructure and supports. One of the largest supports being the need for affordable housing. And you can actually see in this graphic on the screen, kind of the regional impact that inaffordable housing in urban areas can have. So when we think of New York City and kind of inaffordable housing in the process of gentrification and the push of folks that are no longer able to afford the city outside of the city, you can see the impacts that then take place on Long Island, in the Hudson Valley, in the Capital Region, where there you also see land prices going up, and within that, pressure on regional farmland and open space. So as the affordability of real estate extends outwards, the ability for creating and identifying affordable housing in New York City has a regional impact for rural and agricultural areas as well. Water and energy systems, certainly another support that would need to be looked at, where as growth puts greater pressure on regional watersheds, we'll also see higher energy demands that can challenge some of our carbon reduction and water efficiency targets. So whether it's looking at new infrastructure or looking at usage reductions, or looking at how to trade off investment in these systems versus some other environmental goals, if we're looking at limits to our budgetary capacity. Waste management, we'll talk in a second on one of the next slides on waste impacts, but do want to note, for instance, that the market for recycled materials is actually experiencing saturation. So you might not be aware, but within the last 2 years, a lot of urban areas have begun experiencing issues in selling their recycled plastics. So while as consumers, most of us are doing our part in terms of recycling our plastics, the cities and the vendors that are taking these recycled plastics and looking for a market to repurpose them are often not finding a space, just because so many plastics are being recycled and placed into that market. Final note on these challenges is health, and not just kind of healthcare infrastructure, but also looking at issues of maintaining healthy, safe communities and environments, which again, as we kind of go through the slides, we'll open up for discussion later on. And again, no, I'm kind of running through these quickly, but I want to recognize that we're starting with the group a little later than intended, so want to make sure that we respect everyone's time and then can always come back to things towards the end. Folks did want to chat in more detail about them.
And Mike, if you can stay over, and for those who wish to stay over, we can go until 6 p.m. I did get clearance.
Perfect. Yes, yep, I absolutely can stick around for folks that do want to chat in more detail on all of this. Chatting about urban footprints. In terms of the waste that we were mentioning, New York City is producing 14 million tons annually, but a full 1/3 of that is compostable organics. So when we talk about concepts of regenerative design or even sustainability targets, composting is such a really wonderful opportunity to really have a significant impact on this waste stream. Another 10% is plastic packaging. So something as simple as just reorganizing the way in which some of our packaging is being processed, or looking at reducing our plastic intake, again, can have a very significant impact on this waste stream. Carbon emissions, 51 million metric tons of CO2 in 2017, which is the last year for which New York City has official figures. I think that because CO2 is kind of this intangible, gaseous, invisible thing, it's often hard to visualize what that means. So if you can think of how much it would take to kind of squeeze air down until it was a visible solid, and then if we were to take all of that squeezed down visible air and pile it up, you would get this graphic. So this is the 50 million metric tons of CO2 in visible form, so condensed down to the point that air is actually visible, and you're seeing it bury the Empire State Building. So this is a pretty significant amount of CO2 in New York City. And globally, we're looking at cities and urban areas generating 70% of the emissions overall. So as we go into conversation around rural-urban linkages, as rural areas are experiencing some of the impacts of climate change and needing to enact mitigation or adaptation, or look at their own resiliency, cities often have kind of an oversized impact on what rural areas are experiencing. So taking a look at linkages like that and understanding those connections will become important. Last thing on footprints that I'll mention is ecosystem impact. So 40% reduction in flora. So the plant life of New York City over the past century has been rapidly disappearing, which has had major impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, but also when we look at wetland loss and things like that, resiliency to disaster and climate change as well. So again, I'm going to kind of go relatively quickly through the framework around which New York City operates sustainability initiatives. And while sustainability certainly has had a presence in the environmental movement, has certainly had a presence in New York City long before 2007, we're going to use 2007 as a starting point because that is when the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability was formed in New York City. And along with that office was published the PLA. So the PLA NYC became a guiding document for sustainability in New York City in 2007. The PLA, while it's been updated a number of times, is still a really amazing document to look at in terms of the goals it set, the way it broke down those goals into particular milestones and different initiatives, and the wide range of environmental categories that it was covering, from housing and neighborhoods to parks and public spaces to brownfields, waterways, the water supply, transportation, energy, climate change. So even though we're over a decade old on it, if it's not something you've looked at before, worth taking a look, just as kind of a really neat way in which an urban approach to a lot of these urban environmental concerns was processed originally. In 2009, the Greener, Greater Building Plan laws were put into effect, which were 4 energy conservation laws that required retrofits and upgrades, benchmarking and conservation efforts to buildings over 50,000 square feet. So these are larger commercial buildings. Looking at 2011, that was when the first update took place to that PLA and NYC guiding document that we mentioned. This added updates on solid waste initiatives and also interestingly demonstrated some really great progress on some of those original initiatives. So with some of the programs that were put in place by that original plan, milestones were being met. So it was kind of a really inspiring and motivating document in that it demonstrated that with community and political support working together, a lot of these challenges could be addressed in an effective way. 2013, so from the pictures here, that the impacts of Hurricane Sandy changed some of the focus for New York City's sustainability framework. The focus began to look at climate change mitigation and adaptation as a higher priority. The document Stronger, More Resilient in New York and New York City's Pathways to Deep Carbon Reductions was published, which established targets of 80% reduction in the carbon footprint by 2050. And then kind of a final look at the last several years in terms of framework. In 2014, we had a change in our governance. So Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who had kind of originally spearheaded a lot of the framework that we had talked about, transitioned to our current mayor, Bill de Blasio, who formed the Mayor's Office on Sustainability. So kind of moved from that original Office of Long-Term Planning to an office committed to a broad range of sustainability topics. The PLA, that guiding document, was revised to 1 NYC, kind of a new document, also worth a look through if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it or aren't familiar with it. 1 NYC is a much broader document than the PLA was. includes topics like poverty and health policy platforms, but does also include a number of initiatives very specific to what we might consider to be traditional environmental topics. The one NYC document, for instance, proposed carbon neutrality by 2050, so moving kind of beyond those simple 80% reductions and actually calling for carbon neutrality for the city by 2050. Waste reduction with phasing out of single-use plastics and organics collection, kind of as we mentioned before, a new focus on environmental justice, and within that, starting to look at regional interconnections with New York City as a job provider and supporter, and the reliance on the region for affordable housing. In 2019, there were another series of laws that began to take effect with the Climate Mobilization Act. And the Climate Mobilization Act specifically looked at buildings. 70% of New York City's emissions come from buildings. So these new laws required measured improvements with benchmarks set in 2030 and 2040, and the regulations within those laws coming into effect in 2024. Yeah, so I know we're running through these really quickly, and again, if you've got questions or even just like thoughts as we're going through these of things you'd want to come back to and chat in more detail about, please share those in the comments, and we will return in the end to take another look at them. But going into some of the really neat projects that came out of this framework in sustainability. I want to start with the New York City Cool Roofs project. So we mentioned how buildings have a very large impact in New York City's carbon emissions, and a very simple way of reducing emissions is actually adding a reflective paint to the rooftop. So a lot of our rooftops here in New York are tar or EPDM or some sort of black absorbent material that will draw in and kind of hold heat. So simply by painting rooftops white or reflectively was found to be reducing air conditioning costs anywhere from 10 to 30% for participating buildings. Since the start of the program, they've done over 10 million square feet of rooftop coverage at this point. And it's also been a really nice community-driven program, largely through a great nonprofit called Sustainable South Bronx, that's been providing employment in doing both the cool roof painting and in the installation of green roofs with underserved communities receiving employment for those projects. Another initiative to mention is the Community Solar Initiative. This gives a tax credit for solar installations on properties, even if the panels are owned by a third party. So if you have a rooftop, if your building has a parking lot, you don't need to put in any of the cost if you don't want to of installing solar, but you can rent that space to someone that might be interested in installing solar panels. I actually saw this recently just down the street from me over the last year. A parking lot installed solar paneling over all of their parking spaces. So the initiative has been relatively well received, and they are tracking towards a goal of producing a gigawatt of solar power internal to New York City by 2030. And then the last initiative that I'll mention within sustainability, kind of within that existing framework, is the Retrofit Accelerator and the Carbon Challenge. So these are different initiatives that are supporting buildings in reducing their carbon footprint. It provides free analysis tools, free advisory services, free training on how to improve energy and water use efficiency, gives public recognition for any buildings that are participating. Through this program, the city actually had good success in reducing carbon emissions by almost 15%. So this would be dropping our current carbon emissions below 2005 benchmark levels from participants in these programs. So despite population growth in New York City, programs like this can have a significant impact and really achieve some of the milestones towards the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. All right, so I'm gonna, at this point, kind of take the pace down a little bit because I think we've kind of caught up with our actual timing in terms of where the slides are. And actually just want to toss out there if there were any outstanding questions that you were seeing, Anna, that might be worth addressing right away versus holding on to before I move into kind of the next segment in a little more of a paced.
I don't see any questions as of yet. So,
Okay.
but I do encourage everyone to use the chat feature to place your questions there and we'll get them to Mike.
Yeah, no pressure because, well, yeah, like I said, we'll have, I think, a good amount of time towards the end to open it up to just general discussion. Yeah, if you do have questions as we go through or things that you want to just have more detail on or come back to, feel free to kind of park those into the comment area. We'll take a look at those. So looking at regenerative design, and just to give a quick shout out on the picture, not sure if anyone may have visited this space before, but these pictures are actually from Brooklyn Grange. These are from their Queens location, but their Brooklyn location is actually the largest rooftop farm in the world still. I think Paris is currently building one that may exceed it in the next year or so. So the goals of regenerative design in an urban area. I would say that there's kind of three overlapping principles. One, we certainly mentioned the oversized role that cities have in climate change and carbon emissions. So when we're looking at moving from a sustainability framework to a regenerative framework, we're looking at moving beyond carbon neutrality and actually creating a carbon negative city. Looking at restoring ecosystems. So I mentioned things like the loss of flora, the loss of wetlands, a lot of the ecosystem pressures that those are creating. So again, this is kind of moving beyond sustainability. So moving beyond just the preservation of green and open space and actually rebuilding degraded ecosystems within urban areas like New York City. And then finally, the community aspect of this, so building community connections. So I think this is a really key part to regenerative design in that we want to make sure that we're creating a bioregional framework. So not just looking at New York City as an isolated case point or looking at rural areas as isolated case points, but really considering them as interrelated pieces of a larger network, a larger bioregion. So when we're addressing environmental issues, we are certainly looking at New York City and how it can address those environmental issues, but recognizing the impacts, the participation, and the connections that those have outside of New York City to our region, to rural areas, to the agricultural communities that are serving New York City or supporting New York City with their resources. And none of these, of course, are independent goals, so all of them rely on overlapping, and all of them really require consideration in creating an effective plan and achieving effective outcomes. So a couple of neat initiatives that I at least would argue kind of fall within the category of regenerative design and urban planning. One is the Million Trees Project. This was a very early initiative that came out of the original PLA NYC, so that original guiding document back in 2007. By 2015, the initiative had achieved the goal of planting 1 million new trees in city parks, on streets, and on private property throughout New York City. This increased New York City's urban forest inventory by 20%. So when we're talking about not just preserving existing green space, but actually restoring green space, this was a major expansion of our existing flora. The initiative actually continues, so they are continuing to do tree giveaways. They're continuing with planting processes. They have expanded now to also include stormwater capture through specially designed street tree beds. So it's an active initiative that I think is a really neat example of regenerative design in action within an urban area. Wetland restoration is another one. So there is currently, depending on who you ask, anywhere from about 5,600 to 10,000 acres of wetland in New York City. This represents a loss, again, depending who you ask, of anywhere from 85% to 90% of the original wetlands. Almost all of those wetlands are focused around Jamaica Bay, so this is around JFK Airport, and on Staten Island, which is a slightly less dense area of New York City, for those that might not be familiar with the boroughs. New York City is currently working on acquiring and restoring another 900 acres of wetlands. So what does this look like? They actually did a $20 million environmental restoration of a portion of Alley Pond Park, which is in Queens, the borough I'm in right now. So the project took 16 acres of the park and restored wetlands, reintroduced local plant life, and is part of an overall effort for that area to reduce what's called combined sewer overflows into an adjacent creek and bay. So this goes a little bit into New York City's very historic urban planning history, but New York City's sewage treatment uses a system called a combined sewer overflow system. Some cities have kind of individualized sewers where sewage coming from houses, kind of black water from, or gray water from buildings and houses goes into one stream of processing, and then stormwater, so runoff from streets, from sidewalks, from rooftops, goes into a separate channel. In New York City, they are combined. So all of that goes into a single system, which for the most part is all well and good, unless there's a heavy rainstorm. There's a heavy rainstorm, all of that runoff from sidewalks goes into the same system and actually overflows the system, at which point there is raw sewage being pumped into any waterways where there is kind of an exit channel from the sewage system. So this, of course, is just not a desirable situation at all. So there has been a lot of effort in reducing stormwater runoff by kind of capturing stormwater with projects like this, with wetland restoration, with projects like stormwater catchment through street tree beds with the Million Trees Project. Yeah, the DEP project in Alley Pond Park created new tidal wetlands, created a coastal grassland and a shrubland habitat. Prior to all of this, that acreage had just been urban fill that had been destroyed former wetlands with invasive plants, and was just kind of used as a very standard park experience. But this really restored some of the original ecosystem functions that had existed in that space previously. In terms of climate resiliency and storm surge protection, stormwater capture, that's all wonderful. But these efforts have also led to an increase in the biodiversity. So after 200 years of being gone, you can actually see in this picture up here, beavers returned to the Bronx River. So both as part of the water purity efforts and also in wetland protection efforts, we're seeing biodiversity return in a really significant way. Some of this is even being looked at in terms of creating wildlife corridors and in starting to examine ways of cleansing and moderating air and water temperature. So it's kind of a really neat initiative that's pretty forward-thinking in terms of the ways it could impact New York City and its resiliency to climate change over the medium to long term. Another really neat one. I think that when a lot of us think of regenerative agriculture, silvopasture comes to mind as kind of one of the original tenets and one of the origin points for the regenerative agriculture movement. And applying that to an urban area, so when we talk about things like urban forests, we were talking about things like wetland ecosystems and restoration for that, those are creating opportunities for pasturing. And those opportunities are not hypothetical, that they exist. So in the center here, you can actually see a woodland restoration project that was taking place last year. So this was 2019 and 2018, using goats in Prospect Park in Brooklyn to reduce invasives within their forested areas. Over to the left, chicken keeping is common for a lot of community farms in New York City, and with composting and urban agriculture nonprofits. So there's definitely opportunities for poultry-centered agroforestry. And then a really neat one over to the right. This is not New York City, but this is actually in Berlin, outside of Tegel Airport in Tegel Creek. They are using buffalo for restored wetland restoration. So there's a herd of 13 water buffalo that actually assist in managing the wetlands around the airport area. And I mentioned how there's that big concentration of wetlands in New York City around JFK Airport. It's a very similar environment. So while not necessarily water buffalo, but we really could be looking at projects like these for our area as well. The Billion Oyster Project, another really neat one. There had originally, and we're talking like back in like the 1600s, had over 220,000 acres of reefs in the New York Harbor that supported the oyster industry. By like 1906, they were largely gone, and by 1976, they were completely gone. We have seen a lot of work, again, in waterland purity and restoration that has enabled the return of the oyster industry, and the ecosystem restoration efforts around that led to the Billion Oyster Project, which is actually creating artificial reefs with the goal of constructing 100 acres of reefs with 1 billion live oysters through New York Harbor over the next couple of years. Again, another example of kind of restoring these ecosystems that once existed. And as you may know, oysters have kind of a remediation quality in themselves to water quality. So I think that as we examine the benefits of those, it's just another neat project that we can take a look at as an example of regenerative design in action. The Greenpoint Bioremediation Project. So this is a waterway remediation project that is using these, you can kind of see over to the right, mycelium-laden packets for oil bioremediation in the Newtown Creek. So the Newtown Creek is a Superfund site. It's a waterway that's just had really major contamination from oil and industrial chemical pollution over the last 50 to 100 years. And the efforts for that have largely been community-led in terms of cleaning much of it up with projects like these. There's another project in which an artist actually created small floating islands with oyster mushroom inoculated into it to assist with bioremediation and mycoremediation specifically of some of the oil waste in Newtown Creek. So really interesting project there for sure. The New York City Compost Project. Talked about how we have such a significant portion of our waste stream being compostable organics. The New York City Compost Project is a partnership of 7 different city nonprofits that are just looking at waste recapture and composting as a means of rebuilding New York City soils, while funding was actually suspended during COVID over the last couple of weeks. It has largely been restored to the fiscal budget. So this for a little while was a major point of advocacy in trying to get the funding restored, but I'm happy that for the most part, it is kind of gearing back into place. To the left, you can see an urban farmer, that's Gil Lopez from Smiling Hogshead Ranch, actually applying a compost tea created with compost from his community garden. And then over to the right, Big Reuse, which is a larger scale community composting site that's doing really kind of commercial level composting of organic waste collected at different organic drop-off points in communities throughout Western Queens. The Climate Mobilization Act of 2019 is what I would argue in part is kind of a continuation of that regulatory framework, but I believe also has some regenerative aspects to it, differently than a lot of what we had discussed in that initial section of the slide presentation. So the Mobilization Act is an effort, again, at cutting emissions and creating energy conservation for buildings within New York City. But within that is specifically requiring green roofs or solar and wind energy generation on almost all new buildings, including any rooftops that are under renovation, any rooftops that are over 25,000 square feet. There's a deadline for this in terms of many existing buildings to actually begin installing this in the next 10 years or so. And the goal being by 2044 for the vast majority, ideally all, of New York City's roofs to be utilized for either power generation or as a green roof. So how does this kind of fit into regenerative design? So in having such a broad application, whereas most of the original frameworks were looking at larger lots, we're looking at larger buildings. You're thinking one of the original pieces of legislation, for instance, was talking 25,000 square feet or over. If you have something like a Home Depot, the rooftop of that would need to be green. This is looking at applying it across the board. So smaller residences, smaller businesses, really enforcing and supporting the provision for green roofs across the city, which inevitably will create ecosystem linkages. So I know that there are a number of green roofs that are actually certified wildlife habitats through the National Wildlife Foundation. And these are creating pollinator and bird corridors that are allowing for the restoration of those fauna within New York City's ecosystems. And then kind of a final note as we look at New York City in 2020 and specifically around regenerative communities. Now, this is a slide that really could warrant a workshop, if not a longer course in itself, but I did want to make sure we touched on it, given a lot of the what's been happening this year specifically. I think that 2020 has definitely brought into needed light a lot of the environmental justice issues, not just in New York City, but in underserved communities, I think nationwide. I saw an article the other day that actually termed a lot of these underserved communities as sacrifice zones. So areas which are carrying the consequences of consumptive behaviors from wealthier communities. This definitely exists within New York City. So we see higher asthma rates in poorer communities. We see this also taking place regionally. So rural communities, I mentioned, need to process New York City's waste. They need to produce our energy. They need to produce our food. So the regenerative design movement really needs to ensure that there's an equitable inclusion of all of these communities in any of the policies that and practices that we're enacting to ensure that no community gets left behind. I will kind of give two examples of this kind of either in process or in action. One of those is kind of the possible wins of future legislative change. So I'm sure we're all very familiar with kind of the proposals around the Green New Deal. But I also want to talk a bit about the Climate Equity Act. So the Climate Equity Act was a proposal from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's my local representative here in Queens, but also represents portions of the Bronx, and Kamala Harris in the Senate, that kind of defines frontline communities. So when we talk kind of about these underserved communities that are bearing the strongest impacts of environmental injustice. The Climate Equity Act would look at these frontline communities, so low-income communities, communities that are majority indigenous peoples or communities of color, communities that are experiencing deindustrialization, kind of the economic fallout of that, depopulated rural communities, vulnerable communities that may be majority elderly populations, unhoused populations, people with disabilities, kind of taking a look at all of these different communities that have largely been underserved and often don't have enough of a voice in environmental movements. The Climate Equity Act would work to make sure that any of the benefits from Green New Deal projects and infrastructure investments are being spread out equally across the board to make sure that it is kind of an equitable distribution, and we're all kind of benefiting from our efforts in kind of the environmental and regenerative design fronts. Outside of the legislative community, I also absolutely want to give kind of a shout out in that in New York City, for sure, the community response to COVID has created a really strong mutual aid movement. So while mutual aid has been a part, I think, of New York City's history for a long time, we're seeing a lot of new community-led projects, including food security projects. And this isn't my photograph to the right, but I did want to highlight community fridges that are appearing in New York City and Oakland. So this is one that is in Bushwick in Brooklyn in New York City. That's providing a point of distribution for free food to the local community outside of kind of the traditional institutional systems like food pantries or soup kitchens and things like that. So on a final note, and kind of before I open it up to more general discussion, where to from here? So we started off kind of taking a look at one of the goals being looking at these community connections, so the connection between the urban areas and rural areas, and kind of recognizing our existence not as kind of independent entities with individual goals, but as a bioregion, and any of our efforts towards sustainability and a regenerative community model really requiring a regional resiliency. So not just kind of a local initiative, but really looking at ourselves as an interconnected region. So recognizing, I think, any of these interdependencies and the intersectionality of a lot of the issues that we're dealing with is important. I think looking at bioregional frameworks for tackling any problems, of course, very important. And then continuing to build momentum for advocacy and policy supports, very important. And within kind of advocacy and policy supports, certainly continuing in expanding out and in drawing larger visions for some of the frameworks I've mentioned, but also looking at the ideas from the communities that are being impacted. I mentioned some of the mutual aid work, but also a lot of the community-driven projects that are going on. Not to kind of single them out, but for instance, in New York City, the Extinction Rebellion groups have been very active, not just in advocacy, but also in creating individualized projects that have really had what I would term a very regenerative design, community-driven focus. So at this point, we are around 5:20, which gives kind of 10 minutes to the formal end of the presentation. But like I said, we'll very gladly stick around all the way through 6, as long as we've got the room open as questions or discussion may want to come up. So Anna, I'll kind of turn it back to you if there were any questions or things that folks wanted to talk about initially.
Sure. So what I'm going to do, you can use the chat feature, or you can take yourself off of mute and ask Mike a question directly if you have a comment. I saw something that Elizabeth Henderson put in the chat recently concerning one of the initiatives you mentioned. And Elizabeth, if you're still with us, if you want to take yourself off of mute and give your comment to Mike, you're more than welcome at this time.
What I just pointed out was that there was a pipeline that was aimed right at the oyster area.
Yes.
We stopped it.
Yes.
It was
Yeah.
of a hullabaloo that we stopped it.
When I was mentioning kind of some of the community-driven initiatives that have really been having a major impact, the work of the advocates around the stopping that pipeline were absolutely amazing in the ways that they organized what I think was a very challenging movement where the pipeline had, I think, very strong political support, some very powerful players behind it. So to really see the community that was involved in the advocacy around that succeed was very heartening and really amazing, and I think a really good sign of some of the directions we can go with community.
What's really important in New York State is that there's a network that was developed to ban fracking of thousands of people who will call Cuomo every week about different issues like this, and we just keep doing it. This week it's this one, next week it's another one.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's had amazing success. So yeah, I think you're right on the button there with talking about how well organized the community really became in terms of its advocacy for our community health around that, and looking at things like the pipeline systems that had been proposed, not just that one, but previous pipeline systems as well, and fracking relative to some of our adjacent states like Pennsylvania that haven't had that community level of organization quite yet. And because of that, I think within New York State, we've seen just a lot more success for the environmental movement on that front.
Mike, oh, I'm sorry, go right ahead.
I have a question for you that's kind of a difficult area. That there are lots of not-for-profits around New York City, and some of them are doing some beautiful projects. Nevertheless, within the organization of those projects, the CEO may be being paid well, but the actual work, like on some of the community farms in the city, the people doing the work are being paid minimum wage or not much more than that.
Absolutely.
How do you see building these community organizations in such a way that they will be more fair?
You're right in that is a huge question, and I won't feign any expertise in that specific area. I know Anna mentioned briefly towards the start of the presentation that I'm the Urban Farms Director at Services for the Underserved, which is a larger supportive housing nonprofit for individuals with disabilities in New York City. And speaking personally, rather than from a perspective of kind of a member of that nonprofit, things that I would love to see immediately would be greater representation of the communities we're serving in leadership. So when you look at boards of directors, for instance, so often the boards of directors of a lot of the nonprofits involved in our communities are developed from a fundraising perspective. So these are individuals with Rolodex that they're able to draw on to help fund the nonprofit. And I think that boards largely have for large nonprofits at least, have become a fundraising function rather than a governance and strategic function. And I think that funding, especially over the next couple of years, depending on the direction of the economy and the ability to rely on state and federal monies, will absolutely remain important. So I would not say that we want to lose our connection to funding avenues, but to make sure that the communities that we're serving are included on the leadership is key, because you're exactly right. When we look at the CEOs, when we look at what's called the C-suite, so the kind of the chiefs of the different executive functions of the nonprofits, when we look at the boards, they are too often not representative whatsoever of the communities we're serving. So to take that degree of separation out and to create, for instance, if you had a nonprofit and had a bylaw that at least, let's say initially 30%, and then over the course of maybe 10 years, 50% of your board is required to be drawn from the community that you're serving. I think that would be a really neat way of at least starting to encourage healthier power dynamics and really bring more balance into the existing nonprofit network. And if anyone else has thoughts on this, please feel free to jump in, because I think this is a fascinating topic that I can go on for a while. I will also say that I would not in any way treat the nonprofit world as kind of the be-all, end-all structure for a lot of these movements. I think that the kind of the 501c3 institutional structurized nonprofit system that they're working with is one that we've been working with for a number of decades now, but isn't necessarily the best model to deal with a lot of the immediate and pressing issues that we're starting to come up against, and is also not necessarily the best model to really deal with these power dynamics that you're mentioning. So I think that not saying that they don't have a role, but looking at supporting and finding a place for interaction in with some of these mutual aid groups or community-led groups is also kind of an important component of making sure that the community has a better role in these policies and in these initiatives that are directly impacting them. Yeah, again, sorry to kind of go off on a bit of a rant there, but those are my personal thoughts, and I would love to hear from any other folks that might have experience in nonprofit administration or just thoughts on Elizabeth's question.
That definitely was not a rant. That was spot on, actually.
Thank you.
Well, if no one else has a question, I have another one.
Please, go ahead.
Okay. Actually, Elizabeth, if I can just interrupt you real quick, I'd like to get this one question in about the Brooklyn Grange, if that's possible. And then we can follow back up with your question. So there was a question that came in from Monique about the Brooklyn Grange project. Is there any more information that you can share on that?
Sure. So the Brooklyn Grange, kind of a really interesting project that was started as a commercial rooftop urban farm. So their goal was not necessarily community driven. It was a set of urban farmers that just kind of saw the potential of rooftop farming. And I'm not going to be able to remember their start date offhand, but let's say about like 10 to 15 years ago. That's a little bit of a rough guess there. Decided that they were going to create a commercial rooftop farm that sold kind of hyper-local produce within New York City. Even though they formed as Brooklyn Grange and were originally looking at property in Brooklyn, their initial deal fell through. So their first farm was in Long Island City, Queens, but they kept the name Brooklyn Grange. It was a little under an acre on top of a building that had a pretty strong community presence. It's actually where many of the puppets for Sesame Street are made. So Jim's Henson Studios kind of exist in the lower levels of the building. And the rooftop of the building is just kind of a very large commercially operating farm. So they grow, let's see, really a pretty wide swath of vegetables, not any fruits that I'm aware of. And I don't believe there's been too much focus on herbs, so largely annual vegetables. They do have some chickens up there. The chickens there are less for eggs and more actually because soil fertility is kind of the largest issue that they deal with. So anything that they can do in terms of rooftop composting and things like getting manure directly from the chickens has been really important, because that way they don't have to haul compost or any other produce that would help with soil fertility year to year up all the stairs to get to this rooftop. Prior to COVID, they had been doing a weekly seasonal farmers market there. And then after a few years, they found a space in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is almost exactly an acre, in which they kind of returned to their name and created the Brooklyn Grange in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is kind of a full commercial farm that sells, again, to local restaurants through farmers markets. I believe prior to COVID, they had a CSA. I'm not sure whether it's running this season. And the Queens location, while it still does commercial production and sale at farmers markets, has transitioned to be more of their community nonprofit serving space. So they do a lot of youth education, a lot of community volunteering in the Queens space. And while still growing for production there, Brooklyn has become more of their production hub to support their operations. Again, I think that everything's changed a little bit this season because of the circumstances, but I know that in previous years, they offered once a week formal tours in Brooklyn. They were on Wednesdays of the space, where they would kind of take you on a walkthrough and talk about all the different features that they had. So if you are in New York City at any point and are able to time it to a time when that's open, it is a really amazing space to see. The one in the Brooklyn Navy, like I said, I believe is still the largest rooftop farm in the world until Paris kind of tops us, I think, in the next year or two, unless somebody pulls something out of their pocket in the meantime to top Paris. Yeah, I hope that answered your question, but yeah, feel free if you had any additional questions on Brooklyn Grange to let me know and I can try to answer.
And Elizabeth, I know you had a question, a follow-up question to that. Thank you for allowing me to get that question in from Monique on the Brooklyn Grange. So feel free to go ahead and ask your question.
My question relates to how you define regenerative. I had the pleasure of going on a tour of a number of urban gardens and farms in the Harlem area, as I went to a Black urban farmers conference that was held in New York City. And there were a couple of really large scale hydroponic operations that were producing food for schools, and youngsters were being trained in how to grow food hydroponically. But from the perspective of organic farmers, hydroponic is really not regenerative. It's very, requires a lot of energy in terms of producing the hydroponic setup, artificial lighting, a lot of plastic. And then there's the issue of whether it's actually what the quality of the food that's produced. Plants grown hydroponically will not set seed the way plants grown in healthy soil will. So it's producing food for low-income people in a way that's supposedly inexpensive, but it's second-rate. And yet, when people like me have raised those issues, we've been attacked by people who say, well, you're cutting off the possibility of these great food projects for people of color in the city. So you're being racist by being critical.
Yep,
So there are some intersections there that are very disturbing.
sure, yep. And yeah, I will give the caveat that I will not pretend to own the term regenerative whatsoever. So any thoughts on how I would personally define it, as you're mentioning, I think would be very different from person to person. And I think that kind of our own community is still looking at the exact definition of how we would want to approach regenerative as a kind of a term that might even earn a certification or something like that going forward. So I want to recognize that outside of my thoughts, there's an entire world of discussion around the term of regenerative and what that actually means. My personal way of coming at regenerative has always been to kind of contrast it with the term sustainable. So when we think of sustainable or something sustaining, that means we're kind of holding it in its current space. So we're going from something that's consumptive, so something that's damaging or is degrading of a particular ecosystem or community, and with sustainability, we're moving to a place of stasis where we're no longer drawing more than we return. Regenerative kind of goes beyond that point to the opposite side of kind of the spectrum for me. And I think for me, the key component of anything I would define as regenerative is something that's healing. So it may be healing an ecosystem in restoring the local flora or fauna or local ecosystem function. It may be restoring the soil. It may be reducing, not even reducing carbon emissions, but actually capturing carbon emissions. When we talk about things like carbon farming, having a kind of a carbon negative operation. I think that kind of what you mentioned, and I know that we could probably get into the weeds on this debate quite a bit, is kind of taking a step beyond that and looking at intersectionalities where it may not just be healing kind of the ecosystem functions and healing kind of our climate environment, but also looking at healing the communities that are impacted by environmental justice. So I would agree with you in that hydroponics overall, to me, just in themselves as an operation, I wouldn't see them as something that would earn the regenerative label, just because you're right. Yeah, they're not necessarily having a benefit to soil health and all of these things that you were mentioning. But if it is an organization that does have kind of an environmental justice focus, where they are taking hydroponics and using them as a tool for reducing an inequality or improving access to particular foods for an underserved community, I think we can get into a gray area that I wouldn't want to kind of take the term regenerative away from anyone that wants to use it. So I think that it's still something we're exploring overall, and I think that if we are looking in the broadest way at making sure that something is healing rather than being destructive, then we're okay. I don't think that an organization should necessarily, even if they're doing wonderful community work, take away critiques around their environmental processes. So all of this intersects with each other, right? So if a particular process is more energy intensive, is more water intensive, we mentioned how that in turn has an oversized impact on underserved communities that are often majority Black, Indigenous, or person of color occupied. So to to not recognize that intersectionality. I think that I'm hearing your concern there, and I would agree with that concern. But I would also recognize that not necessarily in that example, but I could see potential examples where we are looking at a much broader definition of regenerative, not just to include soil health, but also community health in ways that we may be healing some of the divisions and injustices that exist there. So I guess in short answer, I hear your concern in that specific instance, and I think without knowing the specifics or the organization, I think I certainly understand where you're coming from in that specific instance. But I would say more broadly, I can understand how they're using that framework to kind of define regenerative, because I think the regenerative term can be a broad one if we want it to be.
Okay, if there are any additional questions, Elizabeth, that was a great question. Monique, you also sent in a great question. We still have a little bit of time, Mike. I don't know if you have any more time that you can share with us, but I'd like to at least give another 5 minutes for those who'd like to send in questions. As well as I wanted to alert people to a few links I put in. The dinner time trivia, which starts at 6 p.m. You still will have time for that. That link is there. And then if you'd like to see any of the vendors that are at the conference, we put the link there for our online vendors, and please feel free to patronize them as well. Mike, as we are starting to come to a close, are there any particular activities that are happening that you'd like to announce or bring to folks' attention? As you know, with the conference, we're getting people from throughout the region. So feel free if there's things you want to announce.
That is an interesting one. Some of them are slightly off topic, but I'll throw a couple of things out there. For anyone that may be in the New York City region, while for my organization, I think we didn't have a slow seasonal start, but we had a slow start to our programming that involved community engagement. We are now kind of in a comfortable place, not in terms of where COVID's at nationally, but in terms of the protocols that we have in place to actually involve the community in some of our activities again. So we actually had our last volunteer day, or I should say our first volunteer day for this season, in one of our community farms in Far Rockaway 2 weeks ago. And it was relatively successful in that we were able to have folks kind of dig out a new water garden and rock garden. We had some folks do some repairs on some of our raised beds. And yeah, we had a good group of 5 to 10 folks that we were able to manage, I think, carefully within that space. And based on that success, we're going to kind of be moving forward with more community projects that are open to anyone in the New York City area that wants to participate. So if you are in New York City, or you're looking to just kind of get out and get your hands dirty at an urban farm, the organization I work for is Services for the Underserved, and going to sus.org will kind of give you some more details and where you can get involved as a volunteer. Another thing I'll give a shout out to, actually a board member for a environmental arts nonprofit called Sultry Art that has been looking at different ways of engaging the art community in different environmental topics and environmental movements for education, for advocacy, and they have been doing some really neat work that I would encourage you to check out. Upcoming, this is a kind of a fun one, but next Saturday, they're actually doing an eco-puppetry festival for puppeteers nationwide, where it's just going to be puppetry around different environmental topics, or puppets that use specific environmental techniques. They have an online curriculum around ecosystems designed for remote or home learning that they published for free that is available online through their website. I think there's like a tab that says Learn, and going there you can access all the different modules for home learning for ages anywhere from I think kind of like the younger set all the way through high school and early college. So yeah, just neat resources to check out if it's something that might interest you. Yeah, I think those are kind of the two that stand out that I'm the most involved in at the moment, of course. Although I would open it to anyone actually that might have other projects in the region that might deserve a shout out or attention.
Right. And Mike, if folks want more information or ask you more direct questions as it relates to some of the projects you've mentioned here in your presentation, what's the best way for them to contact you directly?
Sure, the best way is through email. Perhaps, let me see if I can put my email in the chat, or if you're able to, Anna.
If you want to give me your email now, I'll place it right here.
Sure, yep. My personal email, which I'll go with, is Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L, .w.hollis, H-O-L-L-I-S, @gmail.com. And if you email that, that's my personal email that I check at least once a day. And sometimes, depending on the time of season, a little slow to respond to emails if things are kind of intense in the field, but we'll definitely get back to you eventually if you've got questions or comments or anything you wanted to connect about.
All right. Thank you so much. First of all, personally, I want to give a big thank you to first our audience for being patient with us as we switch from room to room, as accidentally we went into the wrong room. So I'm very grateful for those who stuck around and came back into the room. We're very grateful for your patience. And a big thank you to Mike also for his patience and for such a wonderful presentation. I do have his slides. Michael, it's okay if I share those. So if folks would like to get a copy of his slides, I'm going to put my email here in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me and I will get that to you. I've also put in a link. One of the things we're trying to do during this conference is to pay homage and respect to our First Nation family that were here before colonization. And so there's a link that we placed in the chat where you can go and look up the nation that was in your area, because we're coming from all over the region. For example, the Pocumtuck people, I'm broadcasting from Springfield, Mass. They were here and still are here. They range from Enfield all the way up to Deerfield, Massachusetts. So you get the opportunity to look, and really we want to honor those who were here before colonization, before the European arrival. So please take your time to take a look at that. And that link is in the chat as well. And you can email me and I'll get that to you. So again, thank you to everyone. Thank you for your patience. At 6 p.m. they have dinner trivia. So please join in with that. And then join us back here on Monday starting at 5 p.m. for another round of workshops. So you all have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you, Anna, for coordinating it.
Yeah, thanks, Anna, and thank you, Mike. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for such good questions. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Be well.
Bye-bye. Be well. And dear, it's good to see you again. Michael, thank you so much.
Of course, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for that.